December 17th, 1944, Private First Class Martin Kowalski of the 28th Infantry Division huddled in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid Ardennes air. The forest around him was unnaturally quiet, as if the very trees were holding their breath. Just 24 hours earlier, his squad had disobeyed a direct order to withdraw, choosing instead to set up an unauthorized ambush position along a narrow forest road. Their commanding officer had explicitly forbidden any engagement. The fog was too thick, their intelligence too spotty, their position too exposed. But Staff Sergeant William Harlow had seen something in the patterns of German movement that the brass hadn't. "Sometimes you gotta break the rules to write the rules," he'd told his men as they dug in against orders. What happened in the next 6 hours would defy 75 years of military doctrine. Through the swirling fog, Kowalski could make out the silhouettes of his 7 squadmates spread across 100 yards of elevated terrain. They were outgunned, outmanned, and operating without authorization. According to every tactical manual and field report, what they were attempting was suicide. The 28th had already lost 2 full companies trying to hold similar positions against the German advance. But as the distant rumble of mechanized infantry grew louder, Kowalski gripped his Browning automatic rifle tighter and steadied his breathing. What this single squad of 8 American soldiers was about to accomplish would eventually be classified for decades, not because it revealed any secret weapon or tactic, but because what happened that foggy December morning fundamentally contradicted everything Allied intelligence believed about German military capability in the winter of 1944. The intelligence boys told us we were facing the 12th SS Panzer, Hitler's best remaining forces, Kowalski would later write in a letter home. They said we'd see the elite of the Wehrmacht, battle-hardened veterans with superior equipment and unshakable morale. What we actually saw that morning would change everything we thought we knew about the war. As the first German vehicles emerged from the fog, Kowalski felt his finger tighten on the trigger. What he and his 7 comrades were about to witness would not only save countless American lives, but would fundamentally alter their understanding of the enemy they'd been fighting for years. The 8 Americans were about to discover that the fearsome German war machine was, in reality, a phantom, one that would literally vanish before their eyes. To understand the magnitude of what happened on that fog-shrouded road in the Ardennes, one must first understand the prevailing narrative of German military might that dominated Allied thinking in December 1944. Despite 3 years of brutal warfare and mounting evidence of German material shortages, American intelligence still portrayed the Wehrmacht as a formidable, well-equipped fighting force with significant reserves of men, materiel, and most importantly, morale. This perception was reinforced by propaganda on both sides. German broadcasts boasted of wonder weapons and fanatical resolve, while Allied commanders emphasized the dangerous capability of their enemy to maintain troop motivation and discipline. The Battle of the Bulge, as it would later be known, represented Hitler's last desperate gamble on the Western Front. By committing his remaining reserves to a massive counter-offensive through the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, the Führer hoped to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The attack began on December 16, 1944, catching American forces by surprise and initially making significant territorial gains. The weather, heavy fog and snow, grounded Allied air support, giving German armor and infantry a temporary advantage. Allied intelligence estimated that the offensive involved approximately 25 German divisions, including elite SS Panzer units with the newest Tiger and Panther tanks. Reports described these forces as well supplied, highly motivated, and operating with tactical precision. General Omar Bradley's headquarters circulated assessments claiming that the German troops had been specially selected and supplied for this operation, with each soldier carrying extra ammunition, rations for 14 days, and new winter uniforms. The Germans were portrayed as fighting with the desperation of those defending their homeland, willing to sacrifice everything for a final victory. This narrative was particularly strong within the 28th Infantry Division, which had been mauled during the initial German onslaught. Having suffered over 40% casualties in the first 24 hours, the division's remaining units had been ordered to conduct a fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions. Reports from the front described German mechanized columns advancing with ruthless efficiency. their troops displaying fanatical courage under fire and their logistics operating with trademark German precision. Colonel Robert Frankland, commanding the 112th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Division, had personally briefed his company commanders on December 16th. "Gentlemen, we are facing the best the Germans have left. These are not the second-rate troops we saw in France. These are crack SS units, well-fed, well-equipped, and fighting on Hitler's direct orders. They have fuel, they have ammunition, and most dangerously, they have belief. Each man we've captured so far is convinced they'll be in Antwerp by Christmas." This assessment was shared throughout the Allied command structure. General Eisenhower had mobilized all available reserves to contain the German breakthrough, while intelligence officers pored over captured documents and prisoner interrogations, seeking to understand how the Germans had assembled such a powerful force without detection. The prevailing theory held that the Germans had been hoarding fuel, ammunition, and equipment for months, depriving their forces elsewhere to prepare for this decisive blow. Against this backdrop of perceived German strength, the actions of Staff Sergeant William Harlow's squad take on even greater significance. Harlow, a 32-year-old former history teacher from Wilmington, Delaware, had developed a reputation within the 28th Division as an unconventional thinker. Having fought from Normandy through the Hürtgen Forest, he had survived when many others had not by trusting his instincts over textbook tactics. When his platoon lieutenant was killed on December 16th, Harlow found himself temporarily in command of 11 men cut off from their company. "We were ordered to fall back to St. Vith," Private First Class David Cohen, the squad's radio man, recalled in a 1976 interview. But Sarge had been watching the German movements all day. He said something wasn't adding up. The way they were advancing, the routes they were taking, he said it didn't match what we'd been told about their strength. Harlow had observed the German advance through binoculars from a ridgeline position and noticed what he called hesitation patterns in their movement. "They're not pressing their advantage," he told his men. "They're stopping to regroup every few hundred yards." Those he kept with him represented a cross-section of American society. Kowalski, a steelworker's son from Pittsburgh; Cohen, a pharmacist's son from Brooklyn; Private Thomas Jefferson, an African-American soldier recently transferred from a segregated support unit; Corporal Anthony DiMaggio, a second-generation Italian immigrant from Boston; Private First Class James Whitehorse, a Navajo from Arizona; Private Henry Wilson, a farmer's son from Nebraska; and Technician 5th grade Samuel Goldstein, a mechanic from Chicago. That's not how you exploit a breakthrough if you've got the resources they supposedly have. Against direct orders, Harlow selected 7 men from his depleted platoon and sent the others back with the wounded. "We're going to set up here," Harlow informed them, indicating a rocky outcropping overlooking a sharp bend in the forest road. "Intelligence says a full German battalion will be coming through here at dawn. Battalion strength should be between 600 and 800 men, plus vehicles. That's what they're expecting anyway. I think they're wrong." Throughout the night of December 16th to 17th, the 8 Americans prepared their position, setting up interlocking fields of fire and preparing improvised explosives from their limited supply of grenades and TNT blocks. They had 3 Browning automatic rifles, 5 M1 Garand rifles, 2 Thompson submachine guns, and a single bazooka with 6 rockets. By any military calculation, it was a suicidal position if the German strength estimates were accurate. "Sarge told us to look for specific things when the Germans appeared," Jefferson later wrote in an account that remained classified until 1978. "He wanted to know how many men per vehicle, what their uniforms looked like, how they were spacing their advance elements, and most importantly, how they responded to unexpected obstacles. He said that would tell us more about their true condition than any intelligence report." As dawn approached on December 17th, the squad settled into position. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fog limited visibility to less than 100 yards. At approximately 0530 hours, they heard the first sounds of engines approaching from the east. They were moving slower than they should have been, Kowalski noted in his personal journal. A mechanized battalion with fuel to spare would have been pushing hard. These guys were crawling maybe 15 miles per hour at most. The lead vehicle, a SDKFZ 251 half-track, emerged from the fog at 0545 hours. Harlow signaled for his men to hold fire, wanting to assess the column's composition before revealing their position. What they observed over the next 15 minutes would fundamentally contradict every intelligence briefing they had received. The German column consisted of 11 vehicles, 3 half-tracks, 4 Opel Blitz trucks, 2 Kübelwagens, 1 Panzer IV tank, and a motorcycle with sidecar. According to standard German doctrine, this would represent the advance elements of a much larger force, with the main body following closely behind. But something was immediately, obviously wrong. The half-track that was leading had 23 men crammed into it, Cohen recalled. 23. Standard capacity was 12. They were packed in like sardines, and most of them weren't even wearing proper winter gear. Some had blankets wrapped around their shoulders over their uniforms. As more vehicles appeared, the pattern became clear. Each was overloaded with troops carrying 2 to 3 times their designed capacity. The men were not arranged in tactical transport formation, but were huddled together for warmth. Most significantly, they were not maintaining proper spacing between vehicles, another cardinal rule of mechanized movement in hostile territory. Sarge whispered to me, "Count the officers," Jefferson remembered. I could only identify 3 in the entire column, 1 captain and 2 lieutenants. For a battalion-sized element, there should have been at least 15 to 20 officers. Harlow continued to observe, delaying his order to open fire. The single Panzer IV, which intelligence reports suggested should have been one of dozens, was not behaving as a combat vehicle. It was being used as a mobile shelter, with infantry crowded around its hull seeking protection from the cold. The tank commander was visible in his hatch, but he was scanning the road ahead rather than the surrounding forest, a critical lapse in tactical awareness. At 0610 hours, Harlow gave the signal to initiate their ambush. Goldstein triggered the improvised explosives they had placed overnight, disabling the lead half-track and the Panzer IV. In the same instant, the 3 bar gunners opened fire on the tightly packed vehicles, while the riflemen targeted the visible officers and NCOs. What happened next defied all expectations, and would later prompt a comprehensive reassessment of German capabilities in the final months of the war. Instead of responding with disciplined counter-ambush procedures as their training dictated, the German column disintegrated into chaos. Rather than seeking cover and returning fire, dozens of soldiers simply surrendered immediately, raising their hands and throwing down their weapons. Others fled into the forest, not toward American lines, but eastward, retreating rather than fighting. They were falling over each other to surrender, DiMaggio wrote afterward. I had to stop firing because so many of them were throwing up their hands. There was no organized resistance at all. The tank never even fired its main gun. Within 12 minutes, by 0622 hours, all resistance had ceased. The 8 Americans moved cautiously to secure the area, expecting at any moment to face the main German force that should have been following the advance elements. It never materialized. The entire German battalion consisted of exactly 317 men in the 11 vehicles they had ambushed. There was no main body following behind. As they began processing their prisoners, Harlow's squad made a series of discoveries that would ultimately reach the desk of General Eisenhower himself, prompting a major reassessment of German capabilities. These findings contradicted nearly every assumption about the state of Hitler's Wehrmacht in December 1944. The journey of discovery began with the prisoners themselves. As Corporal DiMaggio, who spoke some German from his childhood in Boston's German-American community, began interviewing the captives, a shocking picture emerged. Of the 317 men captured, only 43 were actual combat infantry. The remainder included cooks, clerks, mechanics, and even 17 convalescing wounded who had been pressed into service directly from field hospitals. Their average age was 37, far older than the 24 average of German infantry earlier in the war. 26 of the prisoners were over 45 years old. I talked to one guy who said he'd been a postal clerk in Dusseldorf until 3 weeks ago, DiMaggio reported. He'd had 4 days of refresher training before being assigned to this unit. Another told me he was a baker from Munich who hadn't fired a rifle since 1941. These weren't elite SS troops. They were the remnants of the German manpower pool, scraped together and thrown into battle. The equipment situation proved equally revealing. The prisoners carried a hodgepodge of weapons, original Kar-98 rifles, captured Soviet PPSH submachine guns, even Great War vintage Gewehr 98 rifles. Ammunition was strictly rationed, with riflemen carrying an average of 25 rounds each, barely enough for 5 minutes of sustained combat. Many had no grenades at all, and those who did carried the simplified concrete-handled Volkshand granite, a poor substitute for the standard German stick grenade. Their uniforms told the real story, Jefferson noted. They weren't wearing the winter gear our intelligence said they'd been issued. Most had summer-weight tunics with civilian sweaters underneath. Some had proper boots. Others had what looked like repurposed civilian shoes. One guy had wrapped newspaper around his feet inside his boots for insulation. The vehicles themselves revealed perhaps the most significant evidence of German material collapse. The single Panzer IV tank, which should have represented Germany's continued armored capability, was operating with a severely damaged transmission that leaked oil continuously. Its turret traverse mechanism was broken, meaning the gun could only be aimed by turning the entire tank. Most critically, it carried only 6 main gun rounds instead of the standard loadout of 87. Their fuel situation was worse than anybody realized, recalled technician 5th grade Goldstein, who had been an auto mechanic before the war. They were running those trucks on a mixture of gasoline and alcohol that was destroying the engines. The Panzer had less than 20 gallons of fuel left, not enough to reach their next objective. And get this, they were carrying empty fuel cans, planning to capture American fuel dumps to continue their advance. The whole offensive was running on fumes, literally. Food supplies told a similar story of desperation. The German soldiers carried rations for only 2 days, not the 14 days reported in intelligence briefings. These rations consisted primarily of ersatz bread, synthetic honey, and a coffee substitute made from roasted grains. Many prisoners admitted they had been told they would be resupplied from captured American stocks. Several hadn't eaten in 24 hours before their capture. Perhaps most revealing was the state of their communications. The entire battalion had only 2 functioning radios, and these could only transmit over short distances due to battery shortages. Messages were primarily relayed by motorcycle couriers, a Great War method that severely limited tactical coordination. The battalion commander had been operating with maps from 1940 that did not show recent road construction or changes. We found their orders, Cohen, who had some German language skills, reported after examining documents captured from one of the officers. They were supposed to be the advance element of the 305th Infantry Division, but the rest of the division existed mostly on paper. Their actual mission was to advance until they encountered American forces, then make enough noise to seem like a much larger unit, while the actual armored spearheads passed to the north. They were a deception operation, not a combat force. As Harlow's men secured their prisoners and established a defensive perimeter, they began to realize the full implications of what they had discovered. The fearsome German battalion they had been told to expect, a key element of Hitler's last great offensive, was in reality a Potemkin force, a hollow facade designed to create the impression of strength where little remained. The psychological impact on the 8 Americans was profound. Having been indoctrinated with years of propaganda about German military efficiency and prowess, they struggled to reconcile those beliefs with the reality before them. Private Wilson, the Nebraska farm boy, expressed this disconnect in a letter to his parents, written 3 days after the ambush. "We've been told for years that the Germans were supermen," he wrote. "Every briefing emphasized their superior training, equipment, and discipline. But Pa, the men we captured were just like us, only hungry, cold, and tired. They didn't want to die for Hitler. They wanted to go home to their families. One old fellow showed me pictures of his grandchildren and cried, 'How do you reconcile that with everything we've been told?'" The Americans' journey of discovery continued as they interrogated the German officers. Captain Wilhelm Steiner, the senior officer captured, had been a mathematics professor before the war. Initially reluctant to speak, he eventually provided devastating insights into the true state of the German army in December 1944. "Your intelligence is months outdated," he told Harlow through Cohen's translation. "What you're fighting now is the hollow shell of the Wehrmacht. Our best divisions exist only on paper. A company that should have 150 men now considers itself at full strength with 60. A battalion listed as 500 might actually field 200. Hitler still receives reports showing full-strength units, but the reality is very different." Steiner revealed that many German units had resorted to a practice called ghost reporting, maintaining fictional strength numbers to satisfy higher headquarters while actually operating at fractions of their supposed capacity. Equipment was similarly misrepresented, with broken tanks counted as operational as long as they could still move, even if their weapons systems were inoperative. Our fuel situation is catastrophic, Steiner continued. This offensive began with enough fuel for perhaps 72 hours of operation. After that, we would be dependent on capturing your supplies. The same applies to ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Germany's strategic reserves were exhausted months ago. What you're seeing now is the last spasm of a dying military system. The revelations continued as the Americans examined the German vehicles more thoroughly. The trucks contained maintenance logs, revealing that they had been cannibalized from 3 different units, with parts scavenged to keep a minimal number of vehicles running. The single Panzer IV tank, supposedly representing Germany's continued armored threat, had been damaged and repaired 7 times. Its armor was compromised by previous hits, and its engine was operating at reduced efficiency due to poor quality synthetic oil. This tank was considered a miracle by our command, Steiner explained. It's one of only 3 operational panzers in our entire division. The others are immobile and being used as stationary artillery, yet our reports to Army Group B claim we have 14 tanks at readiness. Private Jefferson, examining the German small arms, made another telling discovery. Almost half their rifles had shot-out barrels, he noted. The rifling was so worn that accuracy beyond 100 meters would be impossible. They hadn't been replaced because there simply weren't replacements available. The American squad's discoveries extended beyond material deficiencies to the human element of the German forces. The prisoners, once they realized they would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, became increasingly forthcoming about conditions within the Wehrmacht. A consistent picture emerged of collapsing morale, institutional exhaustion, and organizational failure masked by increasingly desperate propaganda. "We haven't received mail from home in 2 months," one sergeant told them. "Rations have been cut 3 times since September. Training for replacements has been reduced from 16 weeks to as little as 6 days. Most new arrivals don't even know how to properly operate their weapons." Another prisoner, a corporal who had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west, provided context that directly contradicted Allied intelligence estimates. "I've been in continuous combat for 37 months, he said. "In Russia, we lost everything, our best men, our best equipment. What you're facing now in the West is what remains after the Red Army has taken its toll. If you could see what I've seen in the East, you would already know this war is over." The testimony of the prisoners painted a picture of systematic collapse hidden beneath a veneer of continued resistance. Supply systems had broken down, with units routinely receiving less than 30% of their requisitioned ammunition and fuel. Medical supplies were so scarce that units had reverted to Great War treatments, including paper bandages and alcohol made from potatoes as antiseptic. Replacement parts for vehicles and weapons often never arrived, forcing improvised repairs or cannibalization. "Last month, our division received a shipment of new boots," one prisoner revealed. They were made of pressed paper with wooden soles. They disintegrated in the first rainfall. "We were told to capture American boots whenever possible." Perhaps most significant was the revelation about the true nature of the Ardennes offensive itself. Far from being Hitler's masterful last gamble with carefully hoarded reserves, the prisoners described it as a desperate, ill-conceived operation that most German officers considered doomed from the start. Resources had not been stockpiled, but rather stripped from other sectors of the front, creating dangerous vulnerabilities elsewhere. The element of surprise had been their only real advantage, and even that had been purchased at the cost of proper preparation. "Our fuel allotment for this operation was calculated based on ideal conditions," Captain Steiner explained. "No allowance was made for detours, combat maneuvers, or even idling to keep vehicles from freezing at night." The planners knew this, but no one dared to contradict the Führer's optimistic expectations. By midday on December 17, 1944, Harlow had compiled enough evidence to warrant immediate communication with higher headquarters. Using Cohen's radio, he made contact with the 112th Infantry Regiment's command post and requested an immediate debriefing team. His report was initially met with skepticism, but the sheer number of prisoners and the detailed nature of his findings prompted quick action. At 1300 hours, a reinforced platoon from Baker Company arrived to secure the prisoners, followed 30 minutes later by Major Robert Harkins, the regimental intelligence officer, accompanied by 2 intelligence specialists and a German-speaking interrogator. What had begun as an unauthorized ambush by 8 soldiers was rapidly escalating into a significant intelligence operation. Major Harkins, initially prepared to reprimand Harlow for disobeying withdrawal orders, was stunned by what he found. After a preliminary examination of the evidence and interviews with select prisoners, he established a secure telephone link to division headquarters. What Sergeant Harlow has uncovered here directly contradicts our most fundamental assumptions about enemy capabilities, he reported. I strongly recommend immediate dissemination of these findings to all frontline units. The German offensive may be far more vulnerable than we've assessed. The impact of the squad's discovery rapidly expanded beyond their immediate tactical situation. By 1800 hours on December 17th, a full intelligence team had arrived from 1st Army headquarters. By December 19th, a summary report had reached General Eisenhower's forward command post. The implications were profound enough to influence strategic decision-making at the highest levels of the Allied command. The most immediate effect was on the American units still engaged in containing the German advance. Armed with more accurate information about the enemy's true capabilities, commanders could make better tactical decisions, taking calculated risks that previously would have seemed too dangerous. Knowledge that German units were undersupplied, undermanned, and operating with severe equipment limitations transformed the defensive battle from desperate resistance to confident containment. Colonel Henry Tucker, commanding the 110th Infantry Regiment, later credited this intelligence breakthrough with saving hundreds of American lives. Once we understood we weren't facing the mythical German war machine, but rather its depleted remnant, we could fight more effectively, he wrote in a post-war analysis. We stopped overestimating their capabilities and started exploiting their weaknesses. The psychological impact on our troops was equally important. The German army was no longer an invincible force, but a desperate one. For the 8 men of Harlow's squad, their unauthorized ambush brought recognition rather than the court-martial they might have expected. By December 23rd, all 8 had been awarded Silver Stars for their actions. More significantly, they had been temporarily assigned to 1st Army Intelligence to help brief other units on indicators of German material weakness. Their first-hand observations proved invaluable in helping other American forces identify similar patterns throughout the battle area. The evidence they had gathered became part of a comprehensive reassessment of German military capabilities that influenced Allied planning for the final months of the war. Their discoveries about fuel shortages, equipment failures, and personnel deficiencies were corroborated by similar reports from other units, building a more accurate picture of the Wehrmacht's terminal decline. The overwhelming evidence of German material collapse continued to mount as the Battle of the Bulge progressed. The pattern that Harlow's squad had identified proved to be systemic rather than isolated. Throughout the Ardennes battlefield, Allied forces encountered German units suffering from the same critical shortages and substitutions. The fuel situation proved particularly decisive. German armored columns began abandoning fully functional tanks and vehicles as their fuel supplies were exhausted, exactly as Captain Steiner had predicted. By December 23rd, less than a week after the offensive began, the advance had effectively stalled not because of Allied resistance, but due to logistical collapse. Prisoner interrogations confirmed that the Germans had gambled everything on capturing American fuel dumps, a desperate strategy that had failed. Statistical analysis of captured equipment told a devastating story of industrial inadequacy. Examination of serial numbers on German weapons showed that many dated from 1941 and 1942, indicating a failure to replace losses. Ammunition lots contained increasing percentages of duds, sometimes as high as 15%, reflecting declining quality control in German factories. Vehicle engines showed excessive wear, with many operating thousands of hours beyond their design limits. They're running on industrial fumes, concluded a 1st Army Technical Intelligence report dated December 26th. German war production has been systematically degraded to the point where they cannot sustain offensive operations. Replacement rates for all major equipment categories have fallen below critical thresholds. The human dimension of German collapse was equally apparent. Prisoner processing centers reported alarming health statistics among captured German soldiers. The average German infantryman captured during the Bulge offensive was 15 pounds underweight. With many showing signs of malnutrition, including dental problems and vitamin deficiencies. Medical examinations revealed that 34% had untreated chronic conditions that would have disqualified them from service in 1940. Age and fitness patterns confirmed Captain Steiner's assessment of manpower depletion. The average age of German prisoners rose from 29 in June 1944 to 36 by December. Teenagers and men over 40, previously uncommon in combat units, now constituted nearly 40% of infantry formations. Training standards had collapsed, with many prisoners admitting they had received less than 3 weeks of instruction before deployment. Equipment maintenance records revealed systematic breakdown in German logistics. Vehicles were operating without proper spare parts, using improvised repairs that compromised safety and performance. One captured maintenance log for an artillery battery showed that they had cannibalized 4 howitzers to keep 2 operational, while simultaneously reporting all 6 as combat-ready to higher headquarters. Communications equipment, once a German strength, had deteriorated to Great War standards in many units. Field telephones often used uninsulated wire due to copper shortages, making them unreliable in wet conditions. Radio sets operated at reduced power to conserve batteries, limiting their effective range. Many units had reverted to message runners for tactical communication, introducing critical delays in battlefield coordination. The quality of German ammunition had declined precipitously. Artillery shells manufactured after June 1944 showed inconsistent performance, with variable propellant charges causing unpredictable ranges. Small arms ammunition inspected from captured stocks revealed poor quality control, with dimensional variations that affected accuracy and reliability. Prisoners reported that misfires and stoppages had become commonplace, with soldiers often carrying cleaning rods into combat to clear malfunctions. The vaunted German tank force, long considered their decisive advantage, proved to be a hollow threat. Technical inspection of captured Panthers and Tigers revealed they were operating with critical component failures that severely limited their combat effectiveness. Transmissions designed for 5,000 miles of operation were being used well beyond 10,000 miles. Engine failures were common, with many tanks unable to operate for more than 4 hours without maintenance. "The German tank we feared no longer exists in meaningful numbers," concluded a January 1945 assessment by Allied technical intelligence. "What remains is a diminishing collection of overused, under-maintained vehicles operating at a fraction of their designed capability. Production of spare parts has fallen so far behind requirements that field-expedient repairs have become the norm rather than the exception." Food supply within German units had deteriorated to crisis levels. Captured ration stores consisted primarily of substitute products: ersatz coffee made from roasted barley, synthetic honey produced from industrial glucose, bread extended with sawdust, and meat rations that contained as little as 20% actual meat. Caloric allocations for frontline troops had fallen from 3,500 calories daily in 1942 to less than 2,200 by December 1944, inadequate for winter combat operations. The psychological transformation among American forces who received this intelligence was profound. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Harrison of the 2nd Infantry Division described the impact on his battalion. "Once my men understood the real condition of the enemy, their whole approach to combat changed. The mythic German Superman had been replaced by the reality of the undernourished, undertrained, and under-equipped opponent we were actually facing. It didn't make them careless. If anything, it made them more effective because they could now accurately assess the threat." For the 8 men of Harlow's squad, witnessing this transformation firsthand was both validating and sobering. Having risked court-martial to follow their sergeant's intuition, they now found themselves at the center of a major intelligence breakthrough. Their observations, combined with similar reports from across the front, had fundamentally altered the Allied understanding of their opponent. "It's strange to think that our little ambush might have changed how the war is being fought," Private Kowalski wrote in his journal on January 3, 1945. "For years we've been told the Germans were supermen with wonder weapons and unbreakable will. Now we know they're just men, hungry, tired men fighting for a cause they no longer believe in, with weapons that no longer work properly. It makes me wonder how much sooner this war might have ended if we'd understood this earlier." The psychological transformation extended to the German prisoners as well. As they were processed through POW facilities, many experienced what military psychologists later termed reality inversion, the profound cognitive shift that occurs when long-held beliefs collapse in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence. For soldiers raised in the hermetically sealed information environment of Nazi Germany, exposure to American material abundance represented a form of psychological shock. Captain Steiner, interviewed at a POW processing center in January 1945, articulated this phenomenon. For years, our propaganda told us that America was suffering from material shortages, that your industry was failing, that your troops were soft and poorly equipped. Then we see the reality. Your soldiers are well fed, your equipment is abundant, your supplies inexhaustible. It creates a kind of mental crisis. If they lied about this, what else was false? The whole ideological structure begins to crumble. This collapse of belief systems manifested in measurable ways. Resistance among German POWs declined sharply as the truth about their situation became apparent. Hardcore Nazi adherents found themselves increasingly isolated as their comrades recognized the magnitude of the deception they had endured. POW camp administrators reported a significant shift in January 1945, with many prisoners actively dissociating themselves from National Socialist ideology and cooperating fully with American authorities. Letters from German POWs, censored but eventually delivered to families in Germany, became a secondary vector of ideological collapse. Despite restrictions on political content, prisoners found ways to communicate the disparity between propaganda and reality. "The Americans eat better than we ever did, even before the war," wrote one captured lieutenant. "Their ordinary soldiers receive chocolate, cigarettes, and canned meat every day. Their medical care is beyond anything available to us. Think carefully about what this means." For the strategic planners at SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the intelligence breakthrough precipitated by Harlow's squad and corroborated across the front led to a fundamental reassessment of the war's timeline. Prior to the Battle of the Bulge, Allied planning had assumed Germany could continue significant resistance well into 1946. By January 1945, revised estimates suggested the European war could end by summer. General Omar Bradley later acknowledged the significance of this intelligence shift. "Understanding the true material condition of the German army allowed us to plan the final offensives with greater confidence. We could accept risks that previously seemed unacceptable because we knew the enemy lacked the resources to exploit our vulnerabilities." This knowledge saved Allied lives and accelerated the end of the war. The evidence gathered during the Bulge fighting directly influenced operational planning for the final Allied push into Germany. Knowing that German fuel shortages were critical, planners prioritized rapid advances that would force the enemy to expend their limited reserves. Understanding that ammunition was strictly rationed, Allied artillery adopted lavish firing schedules to provoke return fire that would deplete German stocks. Recognition that German maintenance capabilities had collapsed led to tactical emphasis on sustained pressure that would accelerate equipment failures. For Staff Sergeant William Harlow and his 7 men, the long-term impact of their discovery extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Their willingness to question received wisdom about the enemy, to observe reality rather than accept intelligence estimates, became a case study in military judgment. By February 1945, their experience had been incorporated into intelligence briefings throughout the European theater of operations. The Harlow ambush, as it became known in military circles, offered several enduring lessons. First, that frontline observations by experienced NCOs and enlisted men could sometimes provide more accurate assessment than formal intelligence channels. Second, that propaganda effects could persist within one's own forces, creating distorted perceptions that influence tactical decisions. And third, that material factors, logistics, maintenance, supply, often determined outcomes more decisively than morale, doctrine, or leadership. The psychological transformation experienced by both Americans and Germans who participated in this discovery highlight the power of material realities to shatter ideological constructs. For American soldiers, recognizing the true condition of the German military removed the aura of invincibility that had influenced their tactical thinking. For German prisoners, exposure to American abundance destroyed the foundation of propaganda they had accepted about Allied capabilities. Private Jefferson, one of the few African-American combat infantrymen to serve in a frontline unit following the integration of replacement troops during the Bulge, captured this dual transformation in a letter written in February 1945. The Germans believed their leaders' lies about their strength and our weakness, just as too many of us believed our leaders' exaggerations about German supermen. The truth was there to see all along. In their worn-out boots, their hungry faces, their patched uniforms, they were never the invincible force we imagined, just men like us, but with far less of everything needed to fight a modern war. The lasting impact of this intelligence breakthrough extended into the post-war period. American occupation authorities in Germany discovered that the collapse of the superiority myth facilitated denazification efforts, as former believers could attribute their defeat to material factors rather than moral or racial inadequacy. The visible evidence of American industrial capacity helped convince many Germans to embrace democratic and economic reforms, seeing practical benefits rather than ideological abstractions. For the 8 members of Harlow's squad, the experience altered their view of both the enemy and the nature of warfare itself. In post-war interviews, all 8 expressed similar reflections about how their understanding had evolved. Private First Class Kowalski, who became a history teacher after the war, perhaps expressed it most clearly in a 1976 oral history recording. "Before that foggy morning in the Ardennes, I believed what we'd all been told, that we were fighting a German military machine of unparalleled efficiency, led by tactical geniuses and manned by fanatical supermen. What we discovered was that beneath the fearsome propaganda image was a military organization in terminal decline, trying to fight a modern war with inadequate resources. Their tanks had no fuel, their rifles had worn-out barrels, their soldiers had cardboard boots and sawdust bread." He continued, "That discovery changed everything for us. It wasn't just about tactical advantage, though that was significant. It was about understanding that material realities ultimately matter more than will or ideology. Germany didn't lose because its soldiers lacked courage or its tacticians lacked skill. It lost because you can't fight tanks with horses, you can't fly planes without fuel, and you can't feed armies with propaganda. That lesson has shaped my understanding of history and politics ever since. The revelation of German material collapse that began with one unauthorized ambush in the fog-shrouded Ardennes had rippled outward, challenging assumptions, reshaping strategy, and ultimately accelerating the end of the war in Europe. What Staff Sergeant William Harlow and his 7 men discovered that December morning was not just the vulnerable condition of one German battalion, but the fundamental truth that lay beneath years of mutual propaganda, that the fearsome German war machine had become a phantom force, maintaining the appearance of strength while disintegrating from within. In the decades following the war, military historians would identify the Harlow ambush as a pivotal moment in the Allied reassessment of German capabilities, a ground-level discovery that helped transform strategic thinking at the highest levels. The lessons derived from their experience would influence American military intelligence doctrine, emphasizing the importance of material assessment over psychological or ideological factors when evaluating enemy capabilities. For the ordinary soldiers of the Western Front, the psychological liberation that came with this new understanding was perhaps the most significant outcome. No longer fighting the mythologized German Superman, they could engage with the reality of an opponent constrained by the same material limitations that govern all military operations. The fog of propaganda had lifted, revealing a clearer battlefield where practical assessments could replace exaggerated fears. In the final analysis, what one squad's Forbidden Friday ambush revealed was not just that a German battalion could vanish in the Ardennes fog, but that the entire conception of German military power in the winter of 1944 had been a carefully maintained illusion, one that dissolved when directly confronted by 8 American soldiers who trusted their own observations over received wisdom. Their discovery accelerated the collapse of that illusion throughout the Allied forces, transforming the final months of the war from a grinding battle against a fearsome enemy to the methodical dismantling of a hollow facade. As Private Wilson wrote to his parents in Nebraska in February 1945, "I used to lie awake wondering how we could ever defeat the German war machine we'd heard so much about. Now I understand that the machine had already broken down. Its gears were stripped, its fuel tanks empty. All that remained was for us to recognize this reality and act accordingly. Sometimes the most important victory isn't winning the battle, but seeing clearly what you're actually fighting.